going to be recorded. And we are going to post this session in archive on our website, comparativehistorical.org, where you can learn more about what we do and what we're about, as well as sign up for our email list if you haven't already. And without further ado, I am going to turn the panel over to our wonderful hosts and organizers, Jack Jen Gary Lee and Anna Scarpellis, who will tell us more about the event. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining. As Nick mentioned, this is the first in our series of professionalization events. And we thought, because most of us who are comparative historical sociologists or work in related fields are not in centers or universities that have a vast number of comparative historical sociologists compared to demography with the population centers that I always eye with one very jealous eye. We thought it could be quite interesting to bring people together to talk about what it is like to do comparative historical work across the life course. So this means starting with people who are finishing their PhDs, have postdocs, are getting their first faculty appointments, but also people who are, who just received tenure, who are well established in the field, to, the big coryphees in our field. And so we decided to invite people from kind of all walks of that very long life course that we have in our field, and ask them a bunch of questions. So the way we wanted to structure this event was we've come up with a set of questions that we will pose to our speakers, and you can ask questions as well. Just raise your hand, and we will, either read your question or let you speak, depending on your choice. And I think I'll leave it at an introduction and turn it over to Gary to introduce our presenters.
Thank you, Anna. So I would like to again welcome all of you, and thank you all for joining us. Let me introduce Anna very briefly. Anna is currently, Anna and I work together with Nick and and Mitch Stevens to kind of come up with this event, and Anna and I have really been thinking about these issues for quite some time. So Anna is currently a digital postdoctoral fellow at MIT, the Migration, Integration, and Transnationalization Research Group at the Berlin Social Science Center, WZB. And so I am an assistant professor of sociology at the New School for Social Research. But more importantly, let me introduce our great slate of speakers. First, we have Maryam Alemzadeh. She is currently a postdoctoral research associate at Princeton's Mustafa Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. And excitingly, in September 2022, a few months from now, she will be Associate Professor of the History of Politics of Iran at the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies and the Middle East Center, and a Fellow at St. Anthony's College. So congratulations to Maryam. Next, we have Marisela Martinez-Cola, who is Assistant Professor of Sociology at Morehouse College. Previously, she taught as Assistant Professor of Sociology at Utah State University from 2018 to 2021. Next, we have Chris Muller, who is Assistant Professor of Sociology at UC Berkeley. He was previously the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health and Society Scholar at Columbia from 2014 to 2016. Next, we have Tony Chen, who is Associate Professor of Sociology at Northwestern University and also the Director of Undergraduate Studies. Then we have, this is a very long list of panelists, and we have Angel Parham, who is my apologies, Associate Professor of Sociology and Senior Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia, and if I'm not wrong, incoming chair of the Comparative Historical section at ASA. And finally, we have Lis Clemens, who's not here yet, I believe, because of some technical complications we had this morning with regards to Zoom. So I thank you all for your patience, but she is the William Rainey Harper Distinguished Service Professor of Sociology and the college at the University of Chicago. So please join me in welcoming the speakers. Anna will lead us off with asking questions and getting this discussion rolling. So thank you all very much.
Thanks for the introductions. So the first set of questions we wanted to ask you are about your kind of identification and your trajectory. How did you become a comparative historical sociologist? So the first question would be, where do you feel most at home, intellectually speaking? And to what extent does this or does not overlap with historical comparative sociology?
Well,
do you want us to go in a particular order, Anna? Oh, sorry.
Chaos.
Go ahead, Marisela.
Whatever you
oh,
would
no
like.
problem. I figured I'd just jump on in. Good afternoon or morning, everyone, depending on which time zone you're in. Yeah, I finally felt like I found my people when I went to the Social Science History Association's annual meeting. And it just felt like I could breathe there because nobody asked, people understood that the history is the data. And I just remember feeling really refreshed at that point. So I would say, and it's an interdisciplinary organization, and so you'll have historians there, and economists there, and sociologists there, and it's an opportunity just to geek out about history. So that's where I felt at home finally.
I can definitely second that. SSHA was where I realized, okay, I'm a comparative historical sociologist. I was like shopping around through ASA sections and couldn't completely decide where I belonged, but SSHA made it very clear. And of course, like made it clear to me that I have to look for interdisciplinary crowds to get better reception. In sociology alone, I work on the Iranian Revolution, and in sociology, a very common reaction that I got with a good intention was, why should I care? I'm quoting verbatim, me being like an American sociologist, my interlocutor. But in area studies, in Middle East studies, in my case, the question was, why has anybody else not do that before? This is very interesting. This is a hot topic. And so it was refreshing. It was good to have that, but also like the ego boosting effect aside, I found that I get like more relevant feedback from an interdisciplinary area studies crowd to like hone my work in a way that comparative historical sociology has taught me to. Like I got better comparison cases, a better context to apply the method and the approach that I was learning in sociology.
So I will make that a third on the SSHA and how important that has been for me. So yeah, that is really, I have an interesting story on that. So I had presented at SSHA, and I was out to dinner with a couple of colleagues, and they made reference to me as a comparative historical sociologist during the meal, and I was very surprised. I said, me? So I date that to becoming a self-identified comparative historical sociologist. This was a little before my first book came out. So I was already, well along with writing the book. It was going to be out soon. But it was that dinner at the SSHA with these colleagues that I started to think about, and they started to say, yeah, but look at the research you're doing, look at, who you're talking to. And I said, I think you're actually right. And so I also credit SSHA and its wonderful interdisciplinary conversations.
Chris, do you want to go?
Sure. So I'll fourth out, I guess, is I totally agree with everything that's been said. I remember learning about the SSHA when I was in graduate school, and I remember my first meeting very well, and definitely feeling at home there. And I think on the history side of things, I was drawn to it for history's attention to context and its skepticism about sort of transhistorical sorts of explanations. And on the social science side of things, one of the reasons I'm a sociologist is that I'm nonetheless interested in patterns that transcend particular contexts. And I think I spent a lot of my time trying to find some kind of happy medium between those two extremes. And I felt that at SSHA, I found a lot of people who were trying to do the same thing. So I agree with what everyone else has said.
Tony, might I prompt you to maybe continue the conversation? Thank you.
Sure, I just have the same answer that everybody's given. So I guess I really got drawn into comparative historical sociology. I think I was a junior professor, and I went to my first SSHA, and I was lucky enough to have Dan Carpenter and Robert Lieberman, who are political scientists, show up to my presentation. And I think I'd already met Dan because we randomly showed up at the Library of Congress at the same time the summer before, and he could tell I was starving, and he bought me a burrito. But then, I sort of got drawn into a set of interdisciplinary networks at SSHA, and I think became capable of imagining where I belonged at this intersection of different disciplines, and so I think of myself, I guess I think of my intellectual interests as a set of Venn diagrams, or as a Venn diagram, and I'm sort of in the middle there, and it overlaps with political sociology and comparative historical sociology and race, and also to a lesser extent economic sociology. So historical sociology is right there in the mix as a core aspect of my intellectual interest. And I kind of, at this point in my career, I think I try to do what I'm interested in, which is generally at that intersection point of the Venn diagram. But historical sociology is, as I say, right there with the rest of my interests front and center. So.
Thanks, Tony. Liz, if I might prompt you to jump into the conversation here.
So also social science history being very important, although, the first time I went, it was a much smaller organization, still very much caught up in cliometrics, basically the use of quantitative data for demographic questions, for political questions, and so forth. So what shifted, I think, is that SSHA became a place for broadly comparative historical work that for a long time was less oriented to quantitative work, but I think that has substantially shifted, particularly with new endeavors based on network analysis and new uses of administrative data, which I think are some of the really important developments in comparative historical sociology. I came into this because I was Theda Skocpol's research assistant, right? So one of the early efforts to sort of define historical sociology as a field was an edited volume that she did, Vision and Method in Historical Sociology. And so I'm thanked there as an RA, so came in quite early. But I think one of the really important things about SSHA that should be mentioned is its flexibility. Comparative historical is a really broad umbrella, and the places where debate and conversation happen are continually shifting. And so because SSHA is driven from the bottom up and allows sort of constant reformulation of groups around new topics, new questions, new issues, I think that feature of SSHA as an organization is particularly important for historical sociology, which is defined and identified not so much by specific issue areas as a general orientation to the nature of social explanation.
I'm kind of wondering in the audience, can we get a raise of hands or like the green button if you have also found yourselves at SSHA? And if not, if you want to weigh in on where you found community, that would be great. Okay, we have a bunch of people at SSHA. Yep, the usual suspects. Great. Does anybody have any questions to the panelists right now? Otherwise, we'll go on. Is that a question, Michael?
Yes, it is. A couple things. So one place that I've found community, I have not been to SSHA, but I've been to SSSP, Society for the Study of Social Problems, and found that to be more interdisciplinary than ASA, and have found community there. And then the question that I would have for everyone on the panel is, what do you consider to be your data when you say historical data? Is it just the archives, or just the archives at the traditional library? Or what are some of the other things that you use when you conduct research?
I can address that. The data I use for my work, I work on something that happened like 40 plus years ago, so not too long ago. It's still considered historical for good reasons, but it gives me the advantage that people who experienced it are still alive. So I did a lot of interviews, like retrospective interviews, which creates complications because, well, memory, like, I don't know, the prevalence of framing during these 4 decades and how it has imposed itself on these people's recollections. Of course, you have to be very careful working with that kind of data, but that was the main chunk of my data. And also, there's a lot of documents that are being published because it's my project has an ideological, not the project, the subject has an ideological nature. The government who came to power after that revolution is still in power and is still working very hard to produce propaganda. So there's a ton of publications that you don't even need to go to the archives for. They publish documents, of course, again, selectively with a particular purpose, but I've been able to make good use of that, hopefully.
Yeah, my data is interesting. So I study school desegregation cases that came before Brown. So I have a book coming out called The Bricks Before Brown. And in particular, I look at Mexican American, Native American, and Chinese Americans cases. And I look at race, class, gender, and age across, there's 3 main cases that I look at. And so when I look at all that, I look at legal opinions, yes, definitely to archival data, but I think and then one of the plaintiffs is still alive, so I was able to talk to her. And then one of the things I had the most fun about was researching the Native American case. And in my book, I talk about history as told by the paper and history as told by the people. And so, when you look at just the paper, when you look at just the opinions, it looks and it sounds like the plaintiff in that case sort of left her Paiute identity and left the, her nation, left the nation, didn't live on the reservation anymore, so that she could be a citizen of the U.S. according to the Dawes Act, right? That's what she was trying to do. But when you hear the story of the people, she still was the family was still very much involved and still connected to the Paiute Nation of Owens Valley. And then later on, I was able to find paper to kind of back that up. But so it's a variety of different aspects, newspapers. I love the archival work, court opinions, and interviews. So
the work that I do extends back 200 to 300 years in colonial Louisiana under the French, the Spanish, and the Anglo-Americans. So it's a wide variety of data, which is really fascinating. So it is mostly archival, but I also very self-consciously do connections between past and present, or kind of looking at how the past informs the present. So then I also have oral histories, in-depth interviews with people today. But I use a lot of 19th century newspapers. In New Orleans, we are lucky to have notarial archives from notary acts that help to give chain of title and give insights into the race of different people who are involved in property transfers. My current book project is very visual and some architectural history. So maps, building contracts, using notary records to even kind of visually reconstruct who was living next to who and what race they were and where there were free people of color. I mean, it's just been fascinating, just really, really great stuff. I'm so excited by all of the data that I have. Some old photographs, from the late 19th century for some of the sites that I'm looking at. So it's been, there's kind of a cornucopia of data that I use everywhere from very old archives in the 18th century up to oral histories and interviews today.
So one comment on an additional source that hasn't been so important to my work, but I've seen used really creatively, is anyone working on the early 20th century. There are often troves of master's theses out there, right? That interview sort of all the ladies shopping in department stores in big cities or things like that. And they're really rich material. Elizabeth Cohen's first book is really based on this. What I wanted to add is it's not just whether you use archives, but how you use them. And I have increasingly taken the position of thinking about archives in the same way that anthropologists would think about key informants. So in my most recent book on voluntarism and state building, I spent a lot of time in the Rockefeller archives. I spent a lot of time in the Red Cross archives, but not because those were cases, but because the Red Cross is an incredibly territorial, paranoid organization. And so it monitored the field. Rockefeller was an incredibly dominant place. So everyone wanted the Rockefellers to know what they were doing, and the Rockefellers wanted to know that everyone else was doing their bit. The Hoover archives function in the same way. So I think we, in some ways, limit ourselves if we think too narrowly about an archive as the voice of the person or the organization that collected it. But these are actually places where you can reconstruct a terrific amount or a slice of a field. In an earlier project, it was the campaign of a woman for Nevada Senate in the early 20th century, because it turned out all kinds of women's suffrage advocates went to Nevada for 6 months to qualify for a divorce. So for this very peculiar reason, that archive on a campaign turned out to be an extraordinarily rich slice into a broader field. So thinking about where you get that broader interconnection, that broader view of a field, can be really important in using archives creatively.
There's a question in the chat that I would like to insert into this debate, and I think maybe actually Chris could speak to this quite well. So Peter asks, does anyone have experience of sharing digitized qualitative data with other researchers, for example, through data repository? Are there any people or projects you would recommend as a model of this practice? In my own work, I found that 18th and 19th century texts are very easy to share. People don't really have concerns. Archives have fewer concerns about them. But for 20th century records, I've faced a lot of issues with the archives not wanting me to share them, which has created a lot of issues because I want to be as transparent as possible about the sources, especially when they're slightly counterintuitive and don't really speak so well to the established historical record. And it's impossible to share them because of privacy regulations and archival regulations. So I'd be quite curious to see whether you've faced in your own work any type of, maybe positive or negative encounters with archivists and data sharing.
Nick.
Go for it.
Yeah, I am not a panelist, but one of the things that I'll sort of add to this discussion, and by the way, Barbara Walters is intervening with some interesting stuff about medievalists, which actually dovetails with one of the points I was going to make, is that I think that over in the digital humanities, particularly with large-scale archives like HathiTrust and a few, especially university archives in the United States, the Beinecke Library at Yale comes to mind. I think they're doing very, very well at modeling this kind of data sharing practice. And one of the key things that they do is, of course, authority control. So if you are interested in sharing an archival document, in my experience, archives will get really, really mad at you if you take pictures of it yourself in the archive and then, post them publicly on a blog or something. And my understanding of the best practices, and please tell me if I'm wrong about this, is that instead, often, if you want to create a new sort of collection of archival material, one of the best things you can do is link back to the actual sort of hard archival locations, which have often digitized the materials and sometimes even have them in public access as well. The one other thing I'll say is that in the United Kingdom, it's extremely difficult to get public access to archival materials because of the way copyright works there. Copyright works in perpetuity often for donated papers to things like the British libraries. So it's very, very difficult to copy materials and share them publicly.
Thank you, Nick. I'm going to kind of take a different turn in the conversation. Firstly, also just wanted to issue a correction. Angel very helpfully corrected me earlier. Jonathan works as the incoming chair of the Comparative Historical section at ASA, so I apologize for my mistake earlier. But let's kind of take a bit more. I love how, like, say, a conversation between historical sociologists really begins with like both SSHA as kind of a very common home, but also like with the archives and the use of the archives or the interconnected use of the archives, and as well as other ways of getting at history. But maybe we could kind of bring in the question of the job market as well. I think. So this is a more practical turn. So my question would be this: like, how did you, say for junior scholars and for senior scholars, your graduate students, present yourselves or themselves on the job market in writing and during interviews? Was historical sociology yours or their primary identity? Because I think it's important to address this, because I think there is, in a sense, an unspoken understanding that jobs in historical sociology are very hard to come by, or jobs that primarily list as historical sociology are very hard to come by. And so there's always this constant challenge of having to kind of justify one's identity as a historical sociologist on the job market. So we're curious as to how the various panelists have dealt with this or navigated this challenge.
Well, when I was on the job market, I called myself a comparative historical critical race scholar. And so the job that I got was in race and ethnicity, but I consistently explained that I always start, I always try to connect past to present to past, and really that all of my courses, what I teach, hopefully the way that I write is very much rooted in being able to explain that first. So it took me a minute to to come up with that phrase because I felt like I was doing so many different things. And I figured that phrase captured everything that I wanted my identity to be. And it seemed to work really well because it sparked conversation.
So my chair was Ed Lauman, whose advice to me going on the market was, go out as an organizations person. Everyone thinks they need one. Everyone thinks they're boring. So go out and be an interesting orgs person. And what that gets to, I think, is a fundamental choice, at least, or at least a recognition that there are two ways of thinking about the role of promoting a kind of inquiry defined by method. One is to create a space specifically for comparative historical. The second, and I'm really an advocate of this, is to historicize everything and make everything comparative. And I think, Marisela's point is excellent. If you look back at sort of the area of race and ethnicity 30 or 40 years ago, it was social psychology, it was interaction, it was very much in the present. And now we're at a point where we have an increasing body of scholarship that actually is sort of assessing the explanatory power of historical legacies versus sort of contemporary correlations. And so my area of political sociology has in some ways always been pretty historical, but I think we see other subfields that have been powerfully historicized. And I really see that sort of as the strategy to come up with something like Marisela's self-description and then make a case for why that area has to be historical.
I might add to that. So I totally agree with what Liz said, and so I think trying to show sociologists who don't think of themselves as historical sociologists why a particular concern in the present is better understood in historical perspective, I think is a good way to go. And I think there are some there's some ways that you can try to translate that claim. So just one that I've thought about is the methodological one. Sociological methodologists are obsessed with missing data, like how we deal with missing data. It's a big issue in causal inference and other sorts of things. But we don't typically think of presentism as a kind of missing data problem. And I think it really is, because you can really draw the wrong sort of inference by kind of truncating the time period that you study. So in my case, if you want to understand why the Black incarceration rate explodes in the 1970s, you also have to ask the question of why it didn't happen in earlier periods. And then that leads to other questions about why it's lower in the South and in the North and lowest in the cotton growing regions. And all of these other sorts of puzzles, in my view, are actually pertinent to the explanation of the broader trend that you're trying to explain. Or you could take, like the first chapter of Piketty's book, where he's saying, Simon Kuznets develops a whole theory of the relationship between economic growth and inequality based on this narrow slice of a time series. And if you actually broaden it out and put it in historical perspective, you see that that's actually an anomalous relationship. And so I think that's one way of saying to sociologists who might not be inclined to historical work, why it's just methodologically important to sort of look in the kind of broadest historical perspective.
I really like how both Liz and Chris emphasize like historicization, the necessity of historicizing our studies of present, and how Marisela has come with this excellent term to self-identify. It's amazing. I've been advised by Liz, among others, to not focus on comparative historical as my main identity when on the job market. And I completely agree that was the right thing to do. I brought in cultural sociology, theory to some extent, none of them doing very well on the job market either. But I think it at least helped my applications be seen better. But I want to go back to the significance of embracing area studies if you're not working on either the US or a country or area that Americans in general know exists. No offense to my educated colleagues, but I mean, generally speaking, at least they know it as a vacation destination. So if you're not working within those limits, it's really hard to establish yourself as valid within American sociology. Unfortunately, I think while we have come a long way in convincing other non-historical people that historicizing matters, we haven't gone just as far in expanding the geographical circle of significance, the transnationality and the necessity of seeing almost everything within a global context. And so the significance of other case studies. So I had much more success in the area studies job market in general for both of my postdocs and the upcoming professorship. And I think that's the best thing that happened to me in a sense. So yeah, I found a much easier conversation and more enriching conversation within those circles. And maybe more importantly, to quote a dear friend from a conversation from yesterday, hi Muller, now I can approach sociology on my own terms. So I don't have to mold and hammer my work to fit within mainstream sociology anymore. I just can pick and choose and have conversations with the crowds that I like. And yeah, it makes life much easier and intellectually more stimulating.
I wanted to add to that what you were saying about the importance of being able to break out of kind of the stranglehold of the US only. So along with the historicizing and that argument that, in order to really understand phenomena that you need the historical, I think you also need cases outside of the US. So I always, I would present myself in terms of doing work on race, ethnicity, using comparative historical lens. But in my work on Louisiana, because Louisiana is such an interesting case where it was under the French and the Spanish before it was under the Anglo-Americans, and my work is tied into Haiti as well, I was able to make some really incisive observations about race. So if you're just trying to understand what race is as a phenomenon, you're really handicapped if you're only looking at the United States. And so I think that's where the comparative part of it comes in, is that the part of the main goal of the comparison is to be able to sharpen your lens analytically to really be able to get at the core of what a phenomenon is. It's very hard to understand it when you don't have some kind of comparisons to play those phenomena off and to better define them. So I think there's the comparative counterpart of the historicization is also very important.
Could I ask you to reflect, and just picking up on what Maryam and Angel just said, on the comparative angle? I know, from being in writing groups, from talking at conferences, that a lot of us, again, who don't work on the United States, have issues publishing in mainstream sociology journals because it's not sociology, it's area studies. I'm going to phrase this very poorly. Thankfully, I work on Nazis, so I never get that pushback because everybody realizes the relevance of that case. But I'm wondering how people are reacting to this and how you're framing your work when it is not about the United States in order to anticipate those concerns, if you are framing it that way.
Maybe I'll take a stab at this. I think this has been a problem that has also bedeviled me constantly, because you try telling someone that you're studying a set of islands in Southeast Asia that they may or may not know the location of. It's very hard. And I think part of the challenge actually translates into, I think, as Anna, I think you're pointing towards, into a certain kind of intellectual problem, which is, how do we, within which frame do we kind of place our cases? What is X a case of? In other words, to use a kind of an old set of debates, I think, but still very, very present set of debates that have occurred in mainstream sociology. What is X a case of? And I think, there was a prior chat session where Tony actually brought up the whole question of the patterns of legibility that sociologists have in recognizing what cases matter, what cases don't. And this is my hope. I hopefully this is also speaking to Maryam's point on, the salience of drawing on, for example, area studies. The more we do this, the broader that kind of those patterns of legibility expand. The more, as Angel, you put it, the more we realize that we can't talk about race by just talking about the U.S. because the U.S. is a specific story of race in a settler colonial context, for example. And so I think there is something of a process that or larger kind of scale process that we are all embedded in. Lis.
So I'm going to respond to this based on my experience as an editor, and specifically on sort of bouncing off of a panel I was on earlier this year that addressed the problem of publishing international and transnational work in major journals. And the experience of not getting your work accepted is often interpreted as, oh, American sociology isn't interested in the rest of the world. And certainly that is an element of it. But the other side of it is one of the questions that was asked, well, do I have to make my work interesting to American sociologists? And I will say, yeah, if you want to publish in the American Journal of Sociology, where I'm the outgoing editor, yes, it has to be of interest to American sociologists. And that means it has to be highly theoretical, right? That you cannot expect to publish work on other cases if that work is written as though it is a piece for China Quarterly or some other regional big region in that case audience. And sort of the example I put forward is a piece I really love, Mara Loveman's The Primitive Accumulation of Symbolic Power, where she takes not just Brazil, but a tiny, probably little known, obscure to most Brazilianists episode and develops a really big argument off of that intervenes powerfully in a theory debate about state building and state emergence. So the thing to keep in mind is what is on sort of the author's responsibility is to look at their work on another case and to think about, how do I make this powerful for an audience that doesn't come to it with an expectation that this case is intrinsically important. And Anna's point about Nazis, right? Some topics, it's like, oh, fascinating, horrible, but fascinating. But many other cases, it's like, don't know about that. And part of your work has to be to figure out how to present a compelling signal that someone who isn't interested in the case in its own, for its own sake, nevertheless should want to read about this case.
This is really great. I'm wondering, to what extent should we apply this to people studying the United States?
Can I add something to that before, related to your question, Anna, that what Lis is saying, which is completely true, and I agree as a reader myself that that should be the standard. There is, as Anna pointing out, sort of a double standard going on because of the I guess because we are doing sociology in America and it's the American Journal of Sociology, maybe justified, I'm not sure now if it's something up for debate or not. But what you said, Liz, just like attests to how much more difficult it is for non-US cases to get published in mainstream journals. There's just like so much theory work that you have to do. It means you get to submit the pieces with much larger intervals, which brings down your chances of like getting positive feedback, getting in. And also in my experience, it could be like tied to my own work, but I'm not sure. I had this experience for 2 pieces that like I did so much theoretical work, so many responses to different people coming at the different angles, that's asking more theoretical questions, that it became the theory section grew into this huge unrecognizable monster that I hated myself, and like people had much more things to pick at reviewers naturally, not being mean or anything. There was just like too much going on. And so in the end, for at least one of those pieces, I like threw away the monster, sort of like reframed it as an area studies thing, and because I realized it's gotten too far from what I wanted it to say. So that was sort of an unsuccessful experience if you from publishing in sociology perspective. But yeah, I just wanted to point out there is that problem.
Nick.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe complicate and extend a couple of the points that have been made. So I think that there's also an intellectual challenge here for those of us who work on non-US cases, which is that historical social science outside of a few substantive centers of gravity, stuff like, European state formation or the US New Deal, it's a very, very sparse area in terms of substantive coverage. And so it can, I think that there's also an intellectual challenge in addition to the raw sort of political economy of advertising your work in an appropriate way. But, you know, as somebody who works on the 18th century East India Trading Company, I am supposed to be able to have a conversation with people who work on the Dutch East India Company, with people who work on 19th century versions of chartered companies, people who work on colonialism writ large, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the point I'm trying to make here is that I think that there's also a really sheer intellectual challenge that comes from working outside of those more familiar sort of substantive domains. But then also to the sort of broader publication question, I think that there is another challenge here too, which is how you kind of keep your substantive center of gravity while feeling like you have to be true not just to the empirical story, but also to, you know, a substantive case, and then also to a particular body of theory, sort of somehow simultaneously. It's really hard.
I think this being called upon to do all things at once is probably reflected in the review requests everyone is getting. If you're working on a specific country, you probably have the same experience. I get review requests to anything related to Western Europe, Japan, East Asia, Southeast Asia. I work on Japan in the 20th century. I don't know anything about the Philippines, and yet I get papers to review on this, including, you know, books. So it's kind of interesting. At some point, I thought I could create a kind of word cloud of the different expertises that are being assigned to me by reviewers who are struggling to find people, because not many people work on things outside of the United States. And I thought that could be a fun thing to compare at an ASA reception. I wanted to shift the direction in terms of funding. So in the beginning, everybody kind of said that they found themselves at Social Science History Association. Another event that I think was very meaningful for me personally, and also for Gary, this is where I met, for example, Maryam Alemzadeh, was the Chicago Area Comparative Historical Social Science Conference, which was a really, really wonderful event that brought together basically, it was fantastic. Every paper was relevant and interesting. And so I was kind of wondering if you could talk a little bit about initiatives that happen at your relevant universities, how you obtain funding for them, and broader on the question of funding, what funding bodies do you apply for to fund, for example, archival work abroad? Is it the National Science Foundation? How do you bring in postdocs if you have postdocs, for example, research funds, etc.? Is this basically the money question? How do you get it, and how do you use it to build organizational capacities that help comparative historical sociology?
So I was recently awarded an NEH grant thank you, to basically, so I identified over 105 cases that came before Brown. And so I'm digitizing it into an interactive map where you can click on the case and photographs, websites, archival, links to archives will all show up depending on the case, right? And it took me forever to find, I applied, I put this grant to a bunch of different places, sociology. And so it was finally the NEH digital publications that I finally was able to do that. And it's hard because one of the things about doing this work is you don't make any one person happy. So, when you put out your proposal, or like, for example, whenever I used to describe my work, I don't make historians totally happy because there's not enough history. I don't make legal scholars very happy because there's not enough legal scholarship. I don't make sociologists happy because there's not enough sociology in it. And so I think that's one of the challenges with finding funding, is being able to craft it in such a way that says, this is what I'm attempting to do. And I also found at my institution, when I was at USU, they had something called the American West Center. And so again, I was able to get a small grant to go and do the field work I needed to do for the Native American case that I focus on, Big Pine v. Piper. And I think, and the American Philosophical Association. So it's funny because what you do is you find sort of the one area that you can link to, and then really, really emphasize that. But it is hard. I've been finding it very difficult to get sociology-based grants. I'm doing, my next project is on the comedy, the history of race and comedy. And that's going to be what I'm going to try to get through the NSF. And I've got some people that are really helping me with that. But I think that's one of the challenges is you've got to put forth what it is that particular funding agency would be most excited about, if that makes any sense.
Tony, please.
I might have something to say. So I don't have a very good track record of getting funding, so take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt. I did try to apply for some funding for my first book with the NSF and got turned down flat, and actually did better in the NSF political science competition than I did in the sociology competition. But I was able to get some grants from Spencer Foundation for the second book project on the history of affirmative action in college admissions. And so I would say that the reason why they were receptive to the project is because, it addressed a question of, at the time, like of clear public importance, like where did these policies come from and what kind of controversies accompanied their establishment. And so I think that there are opportunities to get funding here and there from various different grant making agencies, but a lot of it depends on whether or not you can frame the work that you're doing historically as something that's relevant to the kinds of present day concerns that these funding agencies might have. So, you know, seeing how your work in the past ties into the concerns of the present, I think it becomes easier and easier over the course of a career, but it's something that you should stay mindful of because it will open up ideas for where to apply for funding. So NSF isn't the only game in town. It's of course a big game. And if you get funded by the NSF, congratulations. But there are other funding agencies focusing on different areas of inquiry like education, or I don't know what other ones I might give, but, you know, focusing on specific areas where you can try to shoehorn what you're doing into their intellectual mission. So.
Liz?
Yeah, I would, I guess, emphasize 2 points. One is that there's real power and necessity of the begging cup, right? That projects get put together by going around and getting $1,000 here, a little bit more there. So when Anne Orloff, Julia Adams, and I did Remaking Modernity, we faced a particular problem that every grant for that kind of summing up of a debate or trying to organize a field was explicitly interdisciplinary. And we were just like, no, we're in this, you know, great area of comparative historical sociology, and we need a chance to talk among ourselves and think about the state of the debates. And so, you know, we're able to get a fund for the advancement of the discipline, which was at the time, I think $9,000 or $10,000, not much for a conference. And then a little bit from this university, a little bit from that university, and quite honestly, finding a group of contributors who were engaged by the topic and so didn't require honoraria, chipped in from their own travel funds, made it happen. So a lot really does happen on a shoestring. And so if you're feeling that, you're not alone. I think the other difference to acknowledge, though, is that different universities have vastly different situations in terms of internal funds, and most kinds of historical sociology, if they don't involve travel, are not wildly expensive. So you can often dig a lot out internally, but recognizing it's a radically different situation for people who are at universities that don't have those internal resources.
I just want to quickly second Liz, that for smaller events and smaller gatherings, I think it's key to keep it interdisciplinary, because then you can tap into different departments and like get small amounts of money from here and there, and also interinstitutional, try to bring a couple of schools together like the Chicago area thing. I'm planning to do something similar. I haven't done it yet, so I'll keep you posted if it's successful. A colleague at McGill suggested, the political scientist, that we do something on post-revolutionary state building, like an annual workshop, once at Oxford, once in McGill, once maybe at a US institute. And when I asked her, okay, you're more experienced, what about funding? She suggested exactly the same, that we'll make it happen. So yeah, hopefully that can still happen in this day and age. Yeah.
If I might, we have about 25 minutes left, but I think one thing I would like to bring in the conversation here, as we kind of started to talk about the kind of more pragmatics, you know, as Anna, you very properly put it, the pragmatics of historical sociology. I spent, so maybe I'll add a little bit of a biographical note. I spent, I think, the early years of my post-PhD career teaching, primarily in teaching-oriented positions. And so teaching, I think, has a very dear place to my heart. But, you know, my question here, I think, is a broader one. And this is something that, you know, that touches on how we, in a sense, ensure that historical sociology continues, and how this maintains itself and grows as a tradition and of thought. So the question here is, how is or was historical sociology taught in your department? Is it, or was it as a methods course or otherwise, or taught otherwise? And maybe you could elaborate a little bit on the approaches or the approach to historical sociology or comparative historical sociology it conveyed. So this is really kind of hopefully getting us to think a little bit more about, like, say, what does it mean to kind of look to the future of historical sociology or comparative historical sociology? So, like,
I could speak to the teaching question. So, I have the good fortune of being in a department that's just full of historical sociologists. So there's competition about who's going to teach the historical sociology classes. And you can even take multiple historical sociology classes, and they'll range from kind of the, small and large scale case comparison sort of studies to other, more methods focused classes. In my own case, I do teach it more as a kind of research practicum. So I teach a course, I think it's called Methods for Historical Social Science. And it has kind of three parts to it. One is just broader meta-theoretical questions that you've got to deal with in thinking about the relationship between history and social science, and the past and the present, in particular, historical persistence. But then the middle section of the course is very practical. I think many people have never stepped foot in an archive, and that's very intimidating. And again, I'm fortunate that we have the Bancroft Library right here. So one of the things we do is we read, Julian Go's piece on empire and policing, and then we go to the Bancroft and look at some of the actual documents that he used in that piece, so we can understand, how to use an archive, and how, not just how you use the archive itself, but how people, in Julian's case, mobilize that evidence to make a particular argument that has resonated with a lot of sociologists. Another thing that we do, I'm sort of committed to this idea of the lost art of browsing. Many students haven't spent a lot of time in the library, so I make everyone go to the HA section of the library, which is the historical statistics section, and walk down every single aisle and pull down anything that looks interesting. And then basically take one thing and write a short memo on how you might use that to write a paper. And many students have actually written papers based on things that they found. And many of the things that they find, actually, they could have found on the internet. They've already been digitized, but they wouldn't have found them through keyword searching. They had to go and actually set foot in the library to find it. There's other parts. The next part of the course is devoted to sort of new methods of thinking about historical research. So using maps, linking data sets, text analysis of historical documents, and oral history. I think it's sort of a menu of all those different sorts of things, but it tends to be a lot of fun for a class. But I think for me, one of the, the main challenges is students will come and say, I want to be a comparative historical sociologist. What does that mean? What do I actually do? And part of the course is try to orient it towards like giving some on-ramps, making it easier to kind of get started and get involved.
So I love incorporating it and trying to incorporate, I should say trying, in every class. So I teach a contemporary theory course right now, and I alliterate a lot just because it helps me remember stuff. But I call it the Du Boisian Deniers, Disciples, and Developers. And so we look in that, it's historical, contemporary, and then what people are doing in the future. And very much like Angel said earlier, it's really important for people to understand that what's happening today is built on a really beautiful foundation. And so I think I try to get them excited about that. I have a very romantic idea about history. And I think that my enthusiasm, as my students, they tell me, as they often tell me, my enthusiasm comes through when it comes to being able to say that. Now, what's wonderful is now I'm at Morehouse College, and they have incredible archives here at the AUC. And so I'm trying to, the next iteration, have the students actually go and engage with materials. I also use it I taught a qualitative methods course for graduate school, and I always had a component of archival, archival analysis. And so I would have, I would work with the archive that, USU had an archive there. A lot of larger universities do. And so I would have the person that was there at the archives basically kind of teach the course, and they again have an opportunity to engage with the materials and things like that. So yeah, and when I teach my race and ethnicity course, when it's taught, I always teach it sort of like the first day is kind of the history of what I'm talking about, and then the second time or the second day that I teach it is the more present day discussions. And so it's always in that lens of history first, then that helps you to understand what's happening today. So I love it. It's fun.
May I add that I think agreeing with everything everyone is saying, but also adding that I think the opposite is true as well. Like you can, that's what I plan to do. I haven't taught a comparative historical methods course yet, but I'm going to soon. And my plan is to show how theories that we have basically developed by studying the present apply to historical cases in terms of like bringing it to life. So the historical work gives us the opportunity to zoom out, see what's happened, see what actors have been involved, how centrally, how marginally, and then zoom in again and study the micro mechanisms and see how micro becomes the macro. And that's the most exciting thing in historical work for me. It's basically kind of a social experiment, if you humor me, to just see, like, study the counterfactuals at the very moment they are emerging. And I think this is something that the present just simply doesn't give you. And like that's the training and mentorship that I got helped me like go this direction. And I'm very grateful for that. And I think this is also an area that we could work on more and excite people to focus on historical cases more centrally.
Lis?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that in many ways, sort of the classic comparative historical methods course would have been built around qualitative versions of, Mill's methods and so on. And the comparative piece of that has just been profoundly undercut by the rejection of any assumption that you can understand different cases as independent in any meaningful way. So there's a way in which much of the methodological heritage of comparative sociology as a kind of brute force engine for developing arguments has been undercut. That's another reason why I think the case to theory to case is ever more important. But at the same time, there's just a proliferation of new methods, whether it's forms of spatial analysis, text analysis, administrative data. If I were starting out now, I would do administrative data. I think that's where the action is. And so it makes it harder, I think, to say that there's a sort of set of methods that are unique to historical sociology, but rather, as Chris suggested, there are a suite of methods that are not uniquely historical, but are powerfully useful for historical inquiry.
Angel?
I just wanted to really kind of just reaffirm what Marisela was saying about incorporating historical approaches into all of the classes. I also have not taught a specifically comparative historical course yet, but may do so in the future. But I do think it's so powerful, especially in undergraduate classes, because I think this is where it starts, is awakening that interest in undergrads who may then go on to do graduate work, So in the globalization class that I taught this spring, I taught it in a profoundly historical way. I mean, that kind of course can be taught in a lot of ways. Many of the, kind of textbook approaches will really mostly focus on, 1970s to the present. But I started in the 19th century and started with the Communist Manifesto, and really, and reading some Polanyi as well, and said, your big project for this class is going to be to kind of take in what you're learning about this 19th century transformation and compare it to the post-1970s transformation and write a 21st century manifesto. It didn't have to be a communist manifesto, but, based on what you're learning, what would your manifesto be today? Where do you see the continuities? Where do you see the changes between this other great transformation? And it just opened up some really wonderful historical and philosophical discussions that we just had all semester long. So, that's exactly what Marisela is talking about. That's, how I think about it. And in my race class, I started in antiquity, which is, not the approach that most sociologists would take. But for me, to really understand what race is, it helps to understand a society where there was nothing quite like our racial system, and then to kind of look across time periods to see how race emerges. So I think especially the more we can do that with undergraduate students and really whetting their appetite for historical inquiry, that is the kind of thing that will help this field to have a future.
Tony?
Just to chime in here. So here at Northwestern, I don't think anybody actually teaches archival research methods as part of a course that they teach, but I do offer like an extracurricular archival methods workshop that I give every few years, and it's sort of like a nuts and bolts. What is an archive, and what are manuscript collections, and how do you know when you need to look in them, and how do you cite the sources in there? How do they fit in your intellectual work, and how do you take notes, and how do you organize your notes, and how do you organize all the photos that you take? And so the nuts and bolts, I think, of instruction for archival research happen outside a lot of courses here. And I think, we're going to develop that a little bit further. And I think Katrina Kissenbung King and I are going to continue to do that going forward. As far as the graduate course I teach in historical sociology goes, I'm in a position, I guess, like Chris, where I'm got an embarrassment of riches in terms of colleagues in comparative historical sociology. So where I fit in the division of intellectual labor is I teach a course on new directions in historical sociology, and so it's almost like it's like the flip side of the golden oldies is like the new directions, and so it's sort of an effort to explore exciting new paths of inquiry in historical sociology with an eye towards nevertheless trying to tie them into trying to sort of explain to the students how they nevertheless fit into the same overall intellectual enterprise. And so, the book, the course is divided into 3 parts, and one part takes a look at new work that takes new approaches to classical concerns, and then the second part takes a look at, this is I guess I should tip my hat here to Liz and her co-authors. Another part of the second part of the course covers books that address the return of the repressed, as it were. And so for the new approaches to classical concerns, we read things like Julia Adams' book, or De Jong et al.'s book on the global bourgeoisie. For the return of the repressed, we look at Julian Go's book on patterns of empire, and Paul Freimer's book on building an American empire. And then the final unit, we look at, I guess the title of the unit is Toward a Historical Sociology of the Present. And we looked at Kathy Thielen's Varieties of Liberalization, and Greta Krippner's Capitalizing on Crisis, and Elizabeth Hinton's From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime. And so I think that the reception to the course has been pretty positive. The students, I think, have been excited. I mean, they all want to take courses on the golden oldies, but I do also think that none of them, I think, few of them, I think, these days are thinking of themselves as wanting to contribute to the conversations that flow from the golden oldies, and they're sort of interested in, well, what's happening now, what's been published in the last 5 to 10 years, and what new directions is the field going in. And so I think I'll probably continue to teach this course, some version of it going forward. Although it's a little bit more work because new directions are always new and you can't always teach the same things. And so, yeah.
Thank you. Maybe if I add a note quickly here, especially for grad students or in the audience, and this is actually more self-reflection on my end. I mean, what embarrassment of riches we have in a way. Embarrassment and riches in terms of the kinds of ways in which we can draw in, teach historical sociology, whether directly, or say by infusing a historical sociological perspective or comparative historical sociological perspective into other areas of teaching. And I think this is so important. This is only something I learned belatedly, where I got hired. My first few positions were non-historical sociology positions, and what I ended up learning is that I could teach law and society. I could teach sociology of law historically. In other words, through the perspective of a historical sociological perspective. And I think the foregoing discussion really shows how one can find that kind of balance, as Nick, you put it, the center of gravity, where you can kind of adapt to the changing needs and demands of the job market, while on the other hand, still maintaining your core as a historical sociologist. I think Anna is going to lead us into the final leg of this, so I'm going to hand it over to her.
Yeah. Yes. So to wrap up, but before I do, also maybe a point of encouragement to people who are on the job market. I think, what Tony said earlier about, finding your niche for funding, for example, that political science might be more hospitable. Marisela receiving funding from the NEH was the National Endowment for the Humanities, right? I've been getting a lot of funding for computational work, although I think that's really the weakest part of my scholarship, and yet that's where I receive funding. So find a niche and run with it. And just because there's maybe no designated postdoc for comparative historical sociology, if you're going to write your book, which takes longer as a comparative historical person, find a way of extending the clock and find a way of allowing yourself and giving yourself and taking the time to write that book, because it just takes longer than it does maybe for other subfields. And so don't feel bad about that. It just takes its time, because you draw on maybe 300, 400 years of archival records written in different languages, and you have to engage in different forms of translation between different data formats, between different languages, etc. So, don't feel ashamed if it takes longer. But I wanted to close the discussion with 2 questions to the panelists that kind of coalesce in some ways. Namely, what would be your recommendation for people going on the job market who have and do comparative historical work? And what kind of future do you see for comparative historical sociology, and how can we kind of make the field thrive and contribute to it thriving?
Well, what I would probably recommend is, and when you go on the job market, many of the employers or prospective employers will ask for a syllabus. And if you haven't taught yet, and of course makes it very challenging. So I would encourage you to come up with a syllabus, that of a way that you would teach the course, and in that be able to show sort of the historical aspects with the readings that you choose, for example. And that kind of signals to individuals, where it is that you go through. So I would, one of the things I didn't realize, I I was under the impression, I'm the first in my family to go to college. And so I was under the impression that everybody was taught how to teach when they did grad school. And, much to my surprise, I found some people just never got the opportunity to teach. So I would probably encourage you all to do that. And I'm more than happy to share any syllabi that I have. If you want to kind of get some ideas and everything, just, email me. I'll put my email in the chat. I'll be more than happy to share that.
Thank you, Marisela. Sorry, Liz.
So I'll take them in reverse order, and in part to really thank the organizers of chat for doing this. I think there are many things about pandemic that we want to leave behind. We so desperately want to leave them behind. But the fact that we can have sort of pop-up SSHA to maintain a conversation through the year by way of Zoom is, I think, one of the things that we should hold on to and perpetuate in small formats and large. So thank you to all the organizers for doing this. I realize it's time, right? I've slipped into being the old person on these panels. It used to be that departments could do open searches, and comparative historical sociologists often did pretty well in them because the projects are so exciting, they're big, they're smart, lots of people could get interested. It's the same reason why historians often do really well at university-wide projects proposals, because everyone loves a great narrative. Everyone gets it. The chemists get it. The psychologists get it, no problem. But now universities, departments are under increasing pressure to designate specific slots. It has to do with the labor lawyers coming to run universities. So I do think you need to take that seriously and figure out a way to present yourself, your historical work, so that it engages with those theoretical questions or with the phenomenon of the present. And those are two different ways. I think the big opportunity for all of us, it goes back to Polanyi, history in the gear of social change. That is where we are right now in ways that are absolutely terrifying. But we are in a moment where thinking about deep historical change is on the front burner in a way that it has not been for some time. And that's an opportunity, an existentially terrifying opportunity, but an opportunity.
Angel?
So since we've had some really good comments on the job market, I wanted to comment on making this or keeping this a flourishing area of study. So I'll just reiterate again the importance of undergraduates and undergraduate teaching. And this is an area where even those of us who are at smaller liberal arts colleges can be a really integral part of this. And I think being really strategic to say, if you like this approach, like there's a way to really focus even more on this and to point them in the direction of comparative historical sociology. I am just utterly convinced that if we did this more often, integrating this into our undergraduate courses, I just cannot really emphasize enough how fun that globalization class was, starting in the 19th century and looking at those upheavals and comparing them to today's. It was just intrinsically comparative and intrinsically historical, and it just made so much sense. And I could see the students really responding to that. And I think the same thing is true with race. I think it would be true with just about any other area, but doing it in a strategic way and then pointing students, especially promising students who may be interested in graduate school, and say, this is a direction that you can go, and perhaps also fortifying those students, because we know how our discipline is that, if they get to graduate school and they're like, well, this isn't what I don't really see much of a focus here. You know, I'm not doing this work in these main on revolutions and welfare states or whatever might be presented as the face in that university, depending on where they go, just to fortify them to know that there's a place for them and there's a way to do this work, even if that's not in the syllabus that they might get or presented in the classics that they might get. I think we have to do a lot of front loading. And I think that would also help to even more diversify the field. I can pretty much guarantee if I had been presented with this work in this way, it wouldn't have taken me, you know, until I was well along in my career to have really identified with this area.
Any other thoughts on the future of the field? That could mean it's going very, very well or very, very badly. But this has been great. Are there any questions from the audience before we wrap things up? Any last comments from the panelists? All right. Shall we call it? Well, thank you to our all-star panel for coming in July. I have shamelessly advertised the CHS mini conference that will happen the day before ASA. You don't have to be an ASA member to attend, it's free. Please come if you like. And thanks everyone.
Yeah, thank you very much for the panelists and the audience as well. This is a very humbling experience and I learned a lot. Thank you all very much.
Thank you all.